Howdy doody everybody. PA, I owe you an apology. Your state clearly has more than 40 minutes of weird stuff, and because of that, today I'm back to recount more stories about your state. From abandoned towns with flaming mines beneath them, to small pig-like creatures that cry at the sight of their own ugliness. Your state is proper strange, but certainly in a good way. Now, before we get started, I just want to say thank you so much for tuning in and let you know that if you want to see my little channel continue to grow, the best possible thing you can do for me is subscribe, like the video, and leave a comment. Also, most importantly, watch until the end. This will never cost you a dime, and it's a quick way to say, hey YouTube, this guy's alright. With this in mind, come with me today and let's see what Pennsylvania's got in store in the weird department. When you hear ghost town, I'm sure your mind wanders to the American West, where towns that were once ripe with gold, silver, copper, or other valuable minerals brought droves of miners in a wave that was all but sustainable. And after the resources were exhausted, these miners left, leaving behind entire towns to essentially rot because they were no longer economically viable. But in Centralia, Pennsylvania, there's another type of ghost town, which I guess is also related to mining, that of coal, but was abandoned in a far less dramatic fashion. In modern-day Columbia County, PA, a community was started in around 1749 when local Native American tribes of the region sold the land that comprises Centralia to colonists for about 500 British pounds. Now, this land changed hands a few times and had a road built through it following this, but the path that led to this region becoming a ghost town began to be forged in 1798 when Robert Morris, a hero of the Revolutionary War that owned about one-third of Centralia's land, surrendered this land to the Bank of the United States due to his bankruptcy, and this bank subsequently sold it to one Stephen Girard for about $30,000, after Stephen learned that there was anthracite coal in the region. A subsequent act in 1832, the establishment of a bar known as the Bull's Head Tavern, was made, and this act led to the town acquiring its first name, Bull's Head. Shortly after its naming, mining, the primary employment in the region, began to be established, and in 1842 much of the land making up Centralia was bought by the Locust Mountain Coal and Iron Company. In 1854, the Mine Run Railroad was constructed going through the region, and it was used to transport coal out of the valley. Two mines quickly followed the construction of this railroad, the Locust Run Mine and the Coal Ridge Mine, with more mines to follow in the 1960s. This resulted in a period of a few decades where more mines and railroads continued to be constructed, establishing more coal production and the expansion of the modern-day Centralia region's coal sales to eastern Pennsylvania. Now let's keep in mind, Centralia at this point was not Centralia, but rather still Bull's Head. But that was changed by one Alexander Ray, a mining engineer, who moved to what is now Centralia and began to lay out streets and plan a village. He's actually the one that tried to name the town Centerville in 1865, only changing it to Centralia because the U.S. Post Office actually had a Centerville already in Schuylkill County. From here, the newly named Centralia was, unsurprisingly, mostly a mining community, with its largest employers being those that mined anthracite coal in the region. And in 1890, the town reached its peak population of about 2,700 people, with 7 churches, hotels, saloons, theaters, a bank, post offices, and a general and grocery store. Peak coal production occurred here about 40 years later, in about 1927, but a decline was in order, as much of the workforce had been impacted by the many young miners who enlisted in the military during World War I in the 1910s. Additionally, perhaps more importantly, the Wall Street crash of 1929 that led to the Great Depression led to the Lehigh Valley Coal Company closing 5 of its mines in the area. Now, the closing of many mines in the region didn't necessarily stop mining in those mines, though. There were still lots of bootleg miners, some of which engaged in a practice named pillar robbing, a practice that was essentially where miners would come in and extract coal from pillars left in mines to support their roofs, which often led to their collapse, something that may have contributed to what we're really here to talk about: why Centralia is a ghost town today. So with this main point in mind, let's recenter. This is where the action in Centralia happens. In May of 1962, the Centralia Borough Council hired 5 members of the volunteer fire company to clean up the town's landfill, located in an abandoned strip mine next to the Odd Fellows Cemetery in town. By all accounts, this was an uneventful task. It had even been done before in prior years when the landfill was located elsewhere. And on May 27th, some firefighters simply set the dump aflame and let it burn for a while. And unlike in past events, the fire was not fully extinguished afterwards, and a small, unsealed opening in the pit the landfill was a part of supposedly allowed the fire to enter the labyrinth of abandoned coal mines below Centralia. I say supposedly because there are multiple accounts about what may have started this fire. Other accounts claim that the fire may have started the previous day when a trash hauler dumped hot ash, or coals, into the open trash pit. And there's actually some evidence for this one, as it was noted in the minutes from a meeting of the borough on June 4th, 1962. At this meeting, there were 2 fires referred to, and multiple bills were submitted by firefighters for fighting fires at the landfill area on this day, confirming this detail. It's worth noting, this same borough was responsible for installing a clay barrier to resist fire spreading between layers of the landfill, but it decided not to complete this task, and it's thought the hot coals that were dumped may have, because of the lack of these barriers, been able to penetrate the coal seam under the pit and start the underground fire in the first place. AKA, this could have been to the borough's poor planning. A final theory even posits that this fire may have started in 1932 in actuality, with the Bast Colliery Fire of 1932, just another mine fire, not having been extinguished, though this particular cause is disputed by individuals that claim to have bootleg mined in this mine without succumbing to noxious gases in the tunnel that otherwise would have been produced by a mine fire. This fire, of course, closed many, if not most, of the local mines given the unsafe carbon monoxide levels that followed, and this fire spread throughout the mine tunnels that ran beneath the town streets. There were attempts to put out this fire, of course, but none of them were successful, and so the mine tunnels in the area were abandoned completely. Now, regardless of what started the fire, folks began to become aware of the problem because of a couple of extremely dramatic events that took place in the decades to follow. For instance, in 1979, a local gas station owner checked the fuel level of his underground tanks and found afterwards that the dipstick he was using was really hot. And afterwards, because of this, he lowered a thermometer into his tank, and he found it was 172 degrees Fahrenheit, about 100 degrees warmer than the normal temperatures, clearly indicative that the flames from the coal mines were warming the earth underneath or around his gas tanks. Additionally, in February of 1981, a sinkhole opened in the backyard of one Todd Domboski's grandmother's house. This was a 12-year-old boy, by the way. He was able to escape the sinkhole, luckily being aided by one of his family members, and alerted others to the sinkhole and alerted authorities. The authorities were curious about the hole, noticing that gas was billowing out of it, and actually tested the air coming from the hole, finding that it contained lethal levels of carbon monoxide. These events occurred in addition to many other sinkholes opening up in the area through the 1980s, as well as large cracks forming in roadways that were venting smoke. Heck, it's even reported that some of the dead in town, those that rest in the town's cemeteries, are believed to have dropped into the fires that raged on below them, literally falling into hell. At this point, it was pretty clear that it was no longer safe to live in Centralia. And rather than try any harder to put out the fires that may have spread to many or all of the mine shafts in the area, Congress allocated $42 million to relocate residents, most of whom accepted the buyout offers they were given and were paid to move. After this decision, of course, Centralia's population waned, and by 1990, only 63 residents remained in town, with the zip code being discontinued in 1992. For a while after this event, the highway leading into the ghost town was a popular, obscure destination, being named the Graffiti Highway for the amount of graffiti drawn on it, but as of recent, even this notable spot has been covered up by the state government. As of now, it's thought that this mine fire will persist for over 200 years. Evidence of the fire can be seen in smoke and steam that are sometimes emitted from vents in the south side of the borough, as well as along some of the abandoned portions of PA Route 61. There are many signs in the region warning of the underground fires, the unstable ground, and the dangerous carbon monoxide levels. Most of the old homes have been reclaimed by nature at this point, and a few of the remaining residents actually won the right to remain in their homes until their deaths, as it seems they provided evidence that the underground fire had either moved or waned, and the air quality locally was similar to that of nearby towns, specifically that of Lancaster. Regardless, though, it seems that at least for a few hundred years, the town that was once Centralia will remain abandoned. So you might have heard the word squonk before. I certainly had, but I never thought much about it. Personally, I first heard this term in reference to something referred to as a chemical squonk, which refers to a sort of molecule that is stable in a solution, but cannot be isolated because it will catalyze its own polymerization or decomposition reaction. Just nerdy chemistry stuff, ignore me. But regardless, this term squonk also refers to something near and dear to the hearts of Pennsylvanians, a depressingly self-aware little creature that is known to live in the hemlock forests of northern Pennsylvania. In terms of their mention in media, these little critters were first mentioned in a book, Fearsome Creatures of the Lumberwoods, with a few desert and mountain beasts, written in 1910 by one William T. Cox. Here, the squonk is described as an ugly little dude covered in warts with loose skin. Because of how ugly it is, this little dude is known to hide from the sight of others, and is even known to cry because of its ugliness. It's so ashamed of how it looks that hunters who have found it note that upon being seen, the creature will start bawling and become covered in its own tears, which, harking back to my chemical reaction I talked about, will dissolve the poor critter, which makes it melt into a pathetic little puddle of tears. Sometimes it's also said that on full moon nights, when the squonk's reflection can be seen in a nearby creek, if it sees itself in a body of water, it will also cry and dissolve itself, and in the morning after this, you might find weird little puddles despite the lack of precipitation. In this fashion, supposedly a man named J.P. Wentling actually once caught a squonk, coaxing it into a bag, and then he carried it home in this bag, noting that on the way home, he felt the bag lightening. And when he got home, he opened it up to find that all that remained inside was a little bit of liquid. Now, modern interpretations of the squonk describe it as a variety of pig-like creature that is covered in warts, with ugly ears, wax, and hair covering its body. In this version, it has 4 legs, and it also has contagious misery, which is to say that you're kind of in danger if you see this little creature. If you see it, you will become just as miserable as it is, and in this version it said that it frequents the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania. And also in this version, the same J.P. Wentling tried to catch one in the Poconos, only to dissolve in his own tears himself and die while trying to capture it. So it sounds like you will also become able to dissolve in your own tears if you see this pathetic little creature. This version of the squonk also reproduces by binary fission, sort of like some microbes. Curious. Now, in pop culture, you'd think this sad little dude wouldn't be too popular, but you would also be wrong. The bands Genesis and Steely Dan have mentioned El Squonko, and modern media has even asserted that this little guy has a cousin, a glonk, an even more pathetic little dude that does literally nothing and dies anyways. Anyways, in real life, if you want to hunt one of these little dudes down, it's said that if you're in a hemlock swamp of PA or the Poconos, you've got a shot. But perhaps the next best thing to capturing a squonk is to visit Johnstown, PA, where in August you can attend Squonkapalooza in 2025, a festival put together to celebrate the squonk and other creatures of Appalachian and Americana folklore, and also cryptozoology. So if you're watching this channel, I'd hazard a guess that you've probably heard of the 1968 film by George Romero, Night of the Living Dead, and perhaps its inspired successor, the 1985 comedy horror Return of the Living Dead. By the way, I'm not saying this is a sequel, just a spiritual successor. Now, this latter movie, Return of the Living Dead, recounts a disaster in Louisville, Kentucky, where the recently deceased were exposed to a chemical made by the Darrow Chemical Company, 2,4,5-trioxin, an herbicide that was used to clear jungles, weeds, enemies' food sources, and even the devil's lettuce, if you catch my drift. In this movie, it was also known to reanimate the bodies of those recently deceased, and in this movie, they recounted that previously, Some of this solution had spilled on bodies in the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania VA hospital, bringing them to life. And while this story is of course fictional, there's an urban legend that this story was actually inspired by real events that occurred in Pennsylvania. Now, bear with me. The military, when this occurred, supposedly seemed less than eager to have this story get out. But according to the urban legend, this actually happened. Although the facts surrounding this event and the urban legend that follows it are not necessarily what I'd consider documented, even to a poor extent. Regardless, the account I most commonly see is that at some point before the late 1960s, some substance with the word trioxin in it, sometimes stated as trioxin 245, aka the exact same chemical that reanimated bodies in the Return of the Living Dead movie, was developed and was used by the Army for various purposes. As I've probably made clear already, I've been around the block with my chemistry classes, and my guess is that this substance, 2,4,5-trioxin, is probably actually referring to 2,4,5-trichlorophenoxyacetic acid, aka an herbicide you might know as a component of the infamous Agent Orange, an herbicide used by the US military during the Vietnam War that is now known to have caused serious health and reproductive problems in those exposed, namely soldiers during the Vietnam War. Heck, even Stephen Hawking posited that this might be one of the deadliest weapons that humans ever created, and I certainly agree that it's one of the most environmentally destructive ones at the very least. Anyways, as the story goes, something relatively simple occurred. Some of this stuff apparently made its way into a Pittsburgh VA hospital in real life, and then into the hospital's morgue, and then somehow it spilled or became airborne near the bodies, and suddenly, it said these bodies were sort of jumping around like they were alive. Just picture how shellfish or octopi sort of flop about when you put salt on them. I kid you not, it said this actually happened. Now, I'm not saying I believe this is the case, but this is the urban legend, and it's worth noting that most reports I'm seeing note that this event may have occurred in 1969, aka the year after Night of the Living Dead was released, but 16 years before the Return of the Living Dead came out. Now, I should note, while it's certainly possible this happened, and that the military doesn't want you to know about it, it's also certainly possible that this is just an urban legend that was created by local Pittsburgh residents after the movie Return of the Living Dead was released, which is exactly why it's in this video. My guess is that this is just an urban legend, but hey, if you know more or have some solid documentation that some of this Agent Orange stuff actually spilled in the bodies of service members, I'd love to read it. So I've heard of this story referred to as that of the Pennsylvania Hermit or the Hershey Hermit, but regardless of what name you assign to it, it tells the tale of a folklore figure from 18th and 19th century Pennsylvania. The story follows William Wilson, born in 1762, an individual from East or West Bradford Township, PA, that was known to come from a family of British sympathizers during the Revolutionary War. Now, at some point in their lives, William's sister, who was named Elizabeth, was condemned for the murder of her children in October of 1874, a crime that many supposedly believed she was innocent of. As the story goes, all that's actually known is that at one point, while traveling to meet her ex-baby daddy, essentially she disappeared for a bit with her children, and then reappeared without them. And shortly thereafter, the bodies of these children were found in the woods near Newtown Square. Funny enough, she was actually explicitly charged with the murder of her two bastard male children. For this, she was charged in October of 1785 with murder of the first degree and was sentenced to hang on December 7th of that year. And this is where the saga begins. William, upon learning of his sister's predicament, believed that this deed was done by some seducer of Elizabeth, who I can only surmise he thought was the father of her children, and he relayed this account to not just William, but also one Judge Atlee and some other respected officials, and William presented this account to the Supreme Executive Council on December 6th of 1785. Funny enough, this council's president was Benjamin Franklin. Anyways, the council ordered the execution to be postponed until the 3rd of January of 1786 to investigate further and collect a list of suspects, and William did just that. He looked for witnesses to try to link someone other than his sister to the crime, and he was actually pretty successful, finding a long list of suspects. But then he got sick, and it all fell apart, because apparently old William lost track of time, and upon getting better, he learned that his sister's execution was the following day. In a panic, William rode to Franklin's home himself to request her sentence be postponed, but he had to wait several hours to see him. Ultimately, one of the members of the council ordered that William's sister not be executed, though, and tasked William himself with making the 15-mile trek back to Chester to deliver his sister's pardon. But upon making it to the ferry to cross the Schuylkill River towards Chester, he found the ferry wasn't in operation because the river was clogged with ice and debris. Sadly, this was the only way across the river. William waited for hours for it to clear, but it did not, and in desperation he drove his horse into the icy water, and while the horse did not make it, William himself was able to swim to the adjacent shore and find another horse to continue his ride to Chester with her pardon. In the meantime, though, the sheriff was actually awaiting a pardon. He thought William's sister was innocent, and he even had flagmen stationed along the route to signal if there was a pardon coming. But he didn't get notice by the time of the hanging, and legally, he couldn't wait any longer, so he pulled the cart from beneath her, allowing her to hang. Shortly after this, the flagmen beckoned that there had been a pardon. They cut Elizabeth down and tried to revive her, but at this point it was too late. As the urban legend goes, in this moment, William's hair turned white, his face became marked by old age, and his English was no longer intelligible for the rest of his life. After this episode, William went back to being a stone carver, his previous occupation, but he quickly lost interest in his job and in society, roaming westward through Pennsylvania and only speaking to others when he needed supplies or food. Local legend suggests he spent some time in the Welsh Mountain region, between Chester and the eastern portion of Lancaster County, and eventually he made his way to the modern-day Hummelstown area, along a route that approximately follows modern-day U.S. Route 322. Eventually, in his travels, he came upon a place that today is known as Indian Echo Caverns in 1802. I suppose he found this place enticing, as it would become his home for the last 19 years of his life. Here, William set up camp, about 4 miles from modern-day Hershey. This cave he made camp in is relatively large, with a 26-foot wide entrance, and a room that William called home that was over 98 feet inside of the cave and around a corner within it. This room isn't directly visible from the outside, and year-round it stays at about 52 Fahrenheit, which is relatively warm for the region during the winter. The only downside is that the cave was known to flood, though William intelligently made his bed on a natural ledge inside of the cave, beside which there are now clear marks that denote where William had placed a rope ladder that he used to reach this ledge. There's also a recess on the floor of the cave that William may have occasionally used as a fireplace, although it's worth noting this wasn't some natural chimney. It would have filled the room with smoke, so he likely rarely did this in his makeshift home. In this cave, William apparently slept on a straw mattress. He had a table and stool and some cooking equipment, and he also had a Bible. He apparently wrote frequently on religious topics, and apparently he was known to have grown a long flowing white beard, attributable to his refusal to shave. In his time here, William became a piece of living folklore too, with it even becoming a sort of local challenge for kids to go and see the local hermit that dwelled within the cave, with the cave being a well-known local feature, although it's said that when visited, William was known to retreat to a hidden crevice within the cave that only he knew about. It's not necessarily known how William died, by the way, but apparently on October 13th of 1821, he was found deceased by some of his neighbors. They'd seen him in good health the prior evening, though, so this was all strange to them. It's not necessarily known exactly where William is buried, but it's thought he was buried somewhere on his friend's farm in Lower Swatara Township. William's legacy, of course, is that of an urban legend, the Pennsylvania Hermit. Early on, accounts of William's sister's tragedy were the focal point of any discussion around the departed William, and the earliest known printing of the Pennsylvania Hermit story was published in 1839, 18 years after William's passing. Additionally, most of William's writings were not submitted to the public, as he genuinely did not want society to benefit from his work. Quite the negative sentiment, but he did request one thing be published after his death, a 24-page pamphlet that came in 2 parts. one titled The Life of Amos Wilson, that covered William Wilson's story, with the person who wrote this portion being the farmer who lived across the creek from William, and the second part was called The Sweets of Solitude, or Instructions to Mankind, How They May Be Happy in a Miserable World. I think you can infer what this part is about. Regardless, today, Indian Echo Cave, William's home, remains a popular tourist destination where folks come to see the beautiful formations within and graffiti from early Americans. They also come here to listen to ghost stories and to hear the somber tale of a man who didn't get a fair shake in life that called this place home. In 1890-something, a phenomenal, and dare I say first-of-its-kind event occurred in Pennsylvania. A man standing in front of the Buckwampum Historical Society began to perform a concert. That's it. He played music. So clearly in 1890 there had been concerts performed before. So why was this enticing then? Well, it's because he was not striking drums with drumsticks or blowing air into an instrument designed by human hands. No, rather, he was hitting rocks, naturally formed rocks, with a hammer. These rocks were in a boulder field in Upper Black Eddy, Pennsylvania, a place that today is known as Ringing Rocks Park. Ringing Rocks Park, today, is a 7-acre boulder field that has 10 feet in depth of boulders within a forest. And here, if you start banging on rocks, about 1 in 3 rocks are known to ring if you hit them with a hammer or chisel, upon which they emit a bell-like tone. Now, even as of today, it's not entirely clear why these rocks emit a ringing noise, although a few facts about them have been revealed. To start, it's been shown that these rocks ring individually, but do so at tones lower than the human ear can perceive. Another thing worth noting is that it's actually thought that through their interaction with fellow ringing rocks that they create a ringing sound that humans can perceive. For this reason, when pesky individuals take a ringing rock home for themselves, they inevitably find that the rock they brought home with them creates no noise at all, at least not to their ears. So, some more details about these so-called ringing rocks. The boulder field, with ringing rocks, of which there are multiple, in southeastern Pennsylvania and central New Jersey, formed from diabase sills created by mafic magma intrusions during the early Jurassic period. Exposed by erosion and crustal uplift, these sills were fragmented into boulder fields by severe freezing conditions during the Pleistocene epoch. Gotta be honest, I don't really know what this means, but hey, I'm summarizing it for you if you do. I'm not this type of scientist. Now, if I didn't make this clear already, there's also been a ton of controversy around why these boulders ring. And some don't even think it's the boulders themselves that cause the ringing, but rather the arrangement, size, and shape of the boulders that enables the ringing. Again, nothing has really been tested here, outside of the 1960 experimental results I referred to earlier that demonstrated that non-human perceptible ringing occurs and that these rocks don't ring on their own. These are also certainly far from the only ringing rocks, as there are ringing rocks in New Jersey, as I mentioned, but also in Montana and Australia as well, if not beyond this. Regardless, if you're in the area, this place sounds like an experience that is absolutely worth a visit. It's only about 40 miles north of Philly, so if you're around here, it sounds incredible. I know when I'm in the area next, I'll absolutely be paying this area a visit. In a remote, wooded valley about 100 miles northeast of Pittsburgh is a legend about lost gold that was supposedly identified by a local individual and subsequently stolen by a government agency, who under his nose took everything he learned and cashed it in for themselves, never for it or the finder's fee associated with it to be seen again. As the story goes, back during the Civil War era in 1863, there was a train that was making its way through Pennsylvania packed with 52 50-pound gold bars set aside to pay Union soldiers. This gold successfully made its way to Ridgeway, then to Harrisburg, and even to St. Mary's. But after St. Mary's, it was never seen again, at least not with gold or all of the remaining passengers aboard. Speculation ranged far and wide about what happened to the gold, with the wide-ranging opinion being that the trains were ambushed by Confederate soldiers or sympathizers. Now, aboard the train, 3 men did survive, but their tales about what happened to the gold were murky at best in terms of what they divulged about the train ride. One of them, Lieutenant Castleton, while stricken with typhoid fever, divulged the secret of what the train was carrying around its last stop in St. Mary's. My impression is that he simply told that this train was carrying the 52 golden bars. That's about it. Another man named Connors is known to have frequently gotten drunk after the Civil War and boisterously claimed that he knew where gold was buried in the hills of Pennsylvania. Despite this, he died while building roads in California rather than searching for gold or living off of it. Additionally, while not first-hand accounts of the survivors of this train kerfuffle, it's said that at one point, bones, 7 skeletons to be precise, were found along the Elk and Cameron County lines. And when a detective agency came out to see the bones in the 1800s and 1900s, they found 3.5 gold bars in the area with these bodies. Finally, in the 1990s, Jim Burke, a resident of Elk County and member of the Mount Zion Historical Society, met a man, Jack Shaw, who came to the area to study elevation marker accuracy for the government, and this man reported that, of course, while drinking at a local bar, he was shown a golden bar by another local man he met, claiming he found it in the area. Again, as you can probably tell, all of these so-called facts that point to the gold actually existing are simply hearsay, but these are the motivation that drove this legend and drove a man named Dennis Pareda, based out of Harrisburg, PA, to search for it, thus starting this saga. Dennis, in 1974, was actually working at a furniture store in Phillipsburg, and apparently this furniture store hired a psychic named Michael Malley. And since they had him around, Dennis was like, let's show him this map and tell him to find a lost cache of Civil War gold that's supposedly buried somewhere in the state. Obliging, the psychic dropped a pin on the map, which landed directly on a place named Dent's Run, a stretch of Bennett's Valley, about an hour to the north of them in Elk County. At the time, a few of the folks shrugged their shoulders and thought they'd give finding this gold a shot, and Dennis and this small team actually went to the spot indicated and didn't find anything. But despite this, apparently Dennis Pareda continued to tell this tale, as in 2004, his tenant suggested they revisit this strange site. So he, the tenant, and his son packed up and went there, and while searching around, they found traces of pig iron, a material used for Civil War armaments, leaching through the rocks. This led them to push in further, until state officials warned them about the structural integrity of the hole they were digging. FYI, this was the state's right, as they were on state land digging, and the state encouraged him to only search from the surface from here on out, which he did, putting a drill bit straight into the earth one day at one point, and pulling out soft gold, wedged into the tip. He had officially found gold, at least according to him, and the search was on. Now, from here on out, the search was a bit, dramatic. He showed the gold to a state representative, which openly doubted his claim, and in 2012, the state even demanded that he stop digging. Ultimately, though, Pareda maintained interest and wrote an online article about his search for gold in 2017, and it got the attention of a Wall Street Journal reporter, Warren Gettler, who set a meeting between Pareda and the FBI, where Pareda told them his story. The FBI apparently agreed to visit the site he'd been mining for gold, and even applied for a warrant to do so, to get permission to dig. FYI, this is sort of weird, because normally they'd probably just ask the state of Pennsylvania, the rightful owner of the land, for permission, but the FBI claimed they worried the state would just claim the gold for themselves. The FBI also claimed they'd spotted hidden trail cameras in 2015 at the site, which they thought were operated by the state of Pennsylvania, operating excavating equipment. This perhaps indicates that the state had investigated whether or not there was gold here themselves. Now, at this point, it's worth noting, geoscans were run on the land. I should admit, from the article's phrasing, I can't really tell if Pareda or the FBI ran these geoscans, but it seems like these confirmed that there was an underground pocket of metal with density similar to that of gold, and the volume they observed suggested that there might be 9 tons of gold in total, a find worth hundreds of millions of dollars. With this evidence in mind, the FBI began to excavate in March of 2018, keeping Pareda away, and after all of this, 2 days after they started digging, the FBI went to Pareda and basically said, "Hey, sorry dude, we didn't find anything. All of that work you did and those scans, they were wrong. There's nothing in that hole." At this point, the search for gold was over. The FBI said there was none, and I guess they assumed that Pareda would accept their explanation. At this point, I want to ask you, please chime off in the comments how this sounds to you. I'm not at all familiar with mining, and I would love more familiar individuals to tell me if this checks out. Regardless, as you might expect, Pareda of course believes that the FBI simply returned in the overnight hours to the site, exhuming the gold in secret and carrying it off in an armored truck. This isn't wild speak either. There are actually some individuals who observed strange things that night that corroborate this version of events. Here are those accounts. One neighbor, Cheryl Elder, recounted commotion and tons of lights on the mountainside on the night after the first day of work. She said, "It was up like the 4th of July, lending credence to the idea that there may have been ongoing work at night." Additionally, 2 hunters, Eric McCarthy and Don Reichel, his client, were out on the opposite side of the mountain from the FBI looking for elk shed, aka elk antlers, something they, funny enough, referred to as brown gold, and they were on the mountain starting at between 5 and 5:30 a.m. And while they were there, they reported hearing the distant hum of equipment running, and upon cresting the ridge and looking at the opposite side, they actually saw the FBI operation on the slope, with generators powering lights, an excavator working, and a brown-black gash in the earth. There were also apparently people huddling under a canopy. They apparently heard something clanging around and banging and roaring too. The FBI, of course, says the search team didn't arrive on site that day until 8 a.m. The 2 hunters also said that when they reconvened for lunch, they saw a convoy of unmarked SUVs and armored trucks, one of which seemed to be a bit heavier than the others and was loaded to the gills probably. The FBI, of course, denies there were ever any armored trucks brought to the site at all. Now, after all of this drama, geoscans after the dig didn't yield the same results as the earlier ones that suggested potential gold underneath the site, suggesting there was nothing short of dirt below ground now. There are also details that feel, well, flimsy, such as supposed photos of armored trucks leaving the area late at night that were never actually brought forward. Ultimately, Pareda maintains the FBI came in the middle of the night and stole the gold out from under his nose. Pareda has ended up suing the FBI for access to related records and has only received a few documents, but also some photos and videos that supposedly confirm his hunch. No smoking guns yet, though. The FBI maintains nothing was at the site and that no work took place after hours, with only some FBI police personnel securing the site overnight during the excavation and patrolling on ATVs in the area. If we're covering Centralia, we've got to cover something that's actually related to the reason Centralia is a ghost town, and that related feature is called the Big Mine Run Geyser. I'll give you a second to guess. What do you think the Big Mine Run Geyser is? Any guesses in the comments? Well, big surprise, it's a geyser. You know, the ones that jet out water out of the ground. This geyser lies outside of Centralia, in Ashland, Pennsylvania, and here, year-round, you'll see water spewing out from underground into the air. Of course, if you're savvy on your geysers, you'll know well that there are actually no natural geysers in the whole of the East Coast. At least that's what my research said. And that geysers that naturally form generally do so because hot water beneath the surface results in massive pressure gradients, causing water to jet out from beneath the ground and into the air above the surface. This so-called geyser in Pennsylvania, on the other hand, actually formed in part due to human intervention. In the 1930s, when the mine shafts in the area were abandoned, they actually filled with water, and some of this water eventually found its way out through an old ventilation hole here in Ashland. This hole runs about 300 feet down into a mine shaft of the Bast Colliery, a shaft that was active from the 1850s to 1934 and produced more than 10 million tons of anthracite coal. So in short, this whole phenomenon is probably less well described as a geyser, and more aptly described as water just spewing out of a hole in the ground if we're going to be accurate. By the way, this all happens because of the massive amount of water that infiltrates the below-ground coal mines, creating pressure that is relieved by releasing it through this ventilation hole. This geyser varies in height throughout the year, depending on how much rain there's been in the region, but I've seen it reported it can be as tall as 15 feet above the ground. Around this geyser, you'll see the stones and even the sticks also all have a slightly orange hue, too. And why is this? Well, that's because the water is extremely iron-rich, leaving its residue behind. FYI, it's worth noting this geyser is on private property, but it's only about 15 feet from the road, so you can see it without entering the private property, that is, if it's spewing high enough into the air. So you probably wouldn't guess that Pennsylvania has a creature analogous to the Loch Ness Monster. And if you did guess this, you'd probably be even more flabbergasted to know that this creature supposedly resides 160 miles inland from the Delaware River adjacent to Philadelphia, in a spot inland named Raystown Lake. Raystown Lake is a man-made lake that was originally built as a hydroelectric project to control floods and provide electricity. And on this lake, activities such as boating, swimming, scuba diving, and fishing are popular in the waters that are nearly 200 feet deep within it at times. But in addition to these activities, it's said that another activity is common: sightings of waters, churning, accompanied by dark figures below the surface that sort of look like plesiosaurs. And it's these figures and the reptile-like creature they attribute it to that locals refer to as Raystown Ray. Now, the first reported sighting of this so-called ray occurred in 1962 at Old Raystown Dam, and after this dam was destroyed in 1971 to create the 8,300-acre Raystown Lake, these sightings grew even more prominent, with folks visiting the lake reporting to see a dark, shadowy creature swimming beneath the surface that was 50 to 60 feet in length, just kind of swimming about. In 2006, the following iconic set of photographs was even taken by a local fisherman, supposedly detailing a creature swimming below the surface and briefly raising its head out of the water. Here is the iconic first known photograph of Ray. Admittedly to me, this photo is indistinguishable from a bunch of aquatic weeds and a goose, but hey, what do I know? Now, surprisingly, locals generally seem to believe in this creature, and even the managing director of Raystown Lake, Dwight Beal, has said they thought it's been there for a while. He also stated that the creature is private and shy, but is more likely to be seen around April. Maybe that's because it shares some strange kinship with Puxatawny Phil, the groundhog that also dwells in Raystown, funny enough. Additionally, a wildlife biologist at Raystown Lake, Jeff Krause, once stated in writing that the creature must be a vegetarian because they've seen no evidence of the creature eating fellow marine wildlife, and therefore all people that swim in the lake must be safe. Perhaps this statement was kind-hearted sarcasm, but I can't entirely tell. Heck, even the oh-so-reputable Sci-Fi Channel once sent a team from their Fact or Faked Paranormal Files show to investigate the lake with everything from sonar to photo recreations, even trying to catch it with bait, despite it being labeled an herbivore. They, of course, concluded that Ray's existence was plausible due to the number of sightings of the creature, despite them retrieving absolutely no evidence of it. Of course, if we're going to discuss people that believe in this creature, we've also got to talk about people that think it's all a bunch of hooey. So to start, of course, people think this creature is a plesiosaur, just like the Loch Ness Monster, and the Lake Erie Monster we discussed in our Ohio video. Naysayers have a decent counter-argument, though, pointing to the S-curve of the neck shown in pictures being implausible for a plesiosaur-like creature, as research has definitively shown that plesiosaurs were not capable of lifting their heads out of the water in such a manner. Let's be clear, this is a pretty negative point for the plesiosaur argument. Because of this, most say that the underwater photos of something taken in the lake are more likely a large carp, and it's also well known that massive carp are frequent sightings in the Raystown Lake, with nearby vendors even selling food pellets to toss into the water for them. Carp could certainly fit this description, as they're known to be as large as 100 pounds in certain cases, so I wouldn't doubt that one could be responsible for this creature's sightings, although they certainly aren't 50 to 60 feet in length. Additionally, let's be clear about something. Given this is a man-made lake, it is extremely, and I mean extremely, unlikely that anything 50 to 60 feet long could make its way into the lake, unless it was airlifted or transported by freight, which opens up a whole other can of worms if you believe that I'm not getting into here. But hey, if you believe some menacing government agency is transporting plesiosaurs into inland lakes in America, speculate away in the comments, no shame there. Pennsylvania, it has been a treat learning more about you, and I hope that I did your weird folklore justice. So if you made it here, let me ask you the question, do y'all want one more weird video? I think I've got plenty to go. What about a haunted places video too? I've had a blast learning about your state, and I think there's just plenty more to cover. Regardless, with this in mind, I want to say thank you for watching and remind you that whether you just saw a steaming hole in the ground appear in your backyard, or you saw a strange reptilian creature reach its head out from beneath Raystown Lake, don't you ever forget, it's always story time.